All right, now let's begin our global assessment and touch on some of those issues that are really facing our nation and the world right now, things that we need to be concerned about, because we're an active member in what goes on globally. Like I said, we're going to start with the Middle East. Now, I chose this map because we're Americans and we don't know our geography that well, and it always helps. Even I get muddled sometimes, so it always helps to have a good map. When we focus in on here, I want to first just start talking about the Arabian Peninsula. When I mention Saudi Arabia in that region, what's the first thing that comes to people's mind? Oh, oil. Well, it should. It's an oil-rich, energy-rich country. The whole region is. And people often say, oh, we're only over in the Middle East because of the oil. Yeah, we are, but maybe not for the reason you think. Some people think we're there because we want to buy their oil. We have an addiction to oil, therefore we need to have the Middle East oil. The truth is we don't buy our oil from them. The other truth is we're actually producing more oil in our nation now today than we ever have in our history. So we're not there actually to buy that oil from them. So why are we there? Well, these countries over there have some of the highest standards of living in the world. And they have two natural resources, sand and oil. And the world doesn't need sand. How high is their standard of living? You and I can actually go over to some of those countries, go to a mall, ski on man-made snow, buy a Gucci handbag, then go out into the desert heat, get in our Mercedes, and drive home. But they have no wheat fields, they have no timber resources, they have no textiles, they don't manufacture cars, computers, medical equipment. That whole standard of life depends on the sale of oil, that oil gets to market. If their oil dropped by 30%, the percentage that they actually get to market, they become Yemen. That's huge. We're there to make sure that the region stays safe and stable so it doesn't collapse in on people. If violence breaks out there and saboteurs are going after oil lines or station pumps or out to the harbors where they do the loading of the tankers with the oil, what if the Strait of Hormuz was shut down by Iran? Those are real threats to the way of life, to the culture over there. Now understand, we also have a selfish motive in this too. Because what is oil traded in? Oh, US dollars. That's right. We are the world currency to the world. Every time someone wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they need to get US dollars. Hey, I'm Germany, want to buy some oil. Got to get some US dollars, cash your euros in for the American dollar, and then you can buy that. That is why we're the only country in the world that can actually print money. It's not a bad thing, but if we're dependent on that demand signal in order to keep our money printing, in order to keep our economy buoyant, then we should start getting concerned. Right now you'll hear that there's a little rift between DC and Saudi Arabia, and that might be very well. They feel like we need to do more in the region to really make sure it stays stable, because there's going to be a lot of concerns and we'll address the other ones remaining. And when they say they might look elsewhere, who do they mean? They mean China. China's their #1 consumer of oil. China has a very strong currency and a very strong economy. What would ever happen to us? Think about this for those Americans who say we shouldn't be over there. What would happen if China moved in? They assumed the mission and then they became the world currency. Hate to say it, we become Yemen. And we'll talk about Yemen in a moment. Let's talk about some of the other countries over there. We'll swing out over to the right. I'll start with Pakistan. Now, as you all know, you've heard about Pakistan for the last 12 years. They've been a partner in this war as we try to stabilize Afghanistan. Pakistan is a nuclear-capable country. It has a huge nuclear arsenal. That's not an inexpensive endeavor. They spend so much of their budget on their nuclear arsenal and not on schools and the economy and infrastructure. There's a good chance that Pakistan may absolutely financially collapse between 2016 and 2020. Does that matter to us? There's 170 million people in Pakistan. 100 million of them get by on $2 a day. 60 million of them are 15 years old or younger. Do I want that young generation growing up in absolute poverty? Do I want to fuel Islamic unrest? Pakistan is making a poor decision. They're deciding that, well, we know that we're in some troubled financial situations, but we have nuclear weapons. No one's going to let us fail. We're too big to fail. But the truth is the IMF gave them millions, billions with a B, of money back in 2011, and they were told that's all we have. The world is broke. And so far they haven't changed their spending habits. So it should concern us. We don't need more instability in this region. We then have Afghanistan. We've been over there since 2001, and we're still going to be there for a bit. We've made great headway. There's some people over there that really want to fight and save their country. But if we're going to have a candid conversation, the Taliban still have a foothold, and I expect that they'll want to come back. So we've got to do that transition and give them the security that they need to keep the law and governance within Afghanistan after we depart. And we're making great strides to doing that. One of the concerns, though, is, of course, this border right here. We tell them they must secure their border. Too many drugs, weapons, illegal money, people flowing across, terrorists. But that's a really mountainous, hard terrain area. That's not a border you can easily shut down. We're having a problem in our own country keeping our southern border secure. And for the most part, that's a pretty flat, barren piece of ground with a natural terrain feature of a river. So how can I expect them to actually secure that border? If Pakistan collapses, will there be a lot of people migrating from Pakistan into Afghanistan? Those are concerns, things to think about. We'll talk about Iran. And I'll also tie it in with Syria and Iraq. Real fast, if you're not familiar with Islam or the Muslim faith, there are two main branches of Islam, Shia and Sunni. Sunni is the majority. They represent 80% of the Muslims in the world. Shia represent 20%. They're the minority. Of the 57 Islamic nations, only 2 are governed by Shia governments. What are the 2? Iran and Syria. Iran is predominantly Shia. Iraq is also predominantly Shia Muslims. When Saddam Hussein was in charge, he was the Sunni minority, but he was governing them. And that created some angst. The Sunnis and the Shia don't get along. When we talk about Syria, Syria has a majority of Sunnis living within its borders. But that government, run by Assad, is Shia. So what does that mean? Well, Iran has no other real partner of substance in the region other than Syria. They look at Syria as another Shia government that they do not want to fall. Iraq, having a majority of Shia population, has a natural inclination to be drawn towards Iran. They share families across the border. They have a common faith. And they too would like to see, perhaps, at least the population, Assad stay in power. Iran has actually been running a lot of military hardware, as we know, into Syria. And they've been able to fly it in, and perhaps even use the roads, although we're not sure that they are, from Iran right over or through Iraq. Now, we talk about the Shia population in Damascus. Understand, the rebels have made great strides. They would have months ago rolled over Assad's regime in Damascus if it was not for Iranian support and for the backing of Russia. Of course, Russia likes Syria because it needs those warm water ports. It also wants to keep a foothold in the region. It's also a trading partner with Syria and a trading partner with Iran. But let's get back to the Shia. In Damascus, if we actually got rid of Assad today, if we had some way of picking him up, flying him out of there, some people would say, well, the violence would end. But it won't. His military, they're not just fighting to keep him in power, they're fighting for their lives. Because they're Shia, and they know if this doesn't end well for them, the Sunnis will roll over them. So they're fighting for their family and their way of life. So that's important to keep in mind as we look at this area. Let's talk about Yemen for a second. I mentioned Yemen. What's special about Yemen? Yemen has always concerned me for many years. Yemen is the poorest country in the region. The poorest. It has a 35% unemployment rate. In addition to that, it used to be an oil-producing nation, but it has absolutely run out of oil reserves. They've got a little bit less, but it's like having your indicator on your fuel tank in your car in the red zone on the left, and pretty soon it's going to be completely out. So they've been trying to go over to natural gas to get that to supplement their income, to get their GDP up. But 35% unemployment. And depending who you ask, they can have either 2 or 3 wars going on internally in Yemen. I say there's 2. There's a separatist movement in the north. These guys just don't want to be a part of regular Yemen anymore. They're like, hey, we've had enough of it. We want our own country. We're going to try and separate from you. Then there's also a civil war going on. That's 2 groups of people saying, look, I want to be in charge of Yemen. The other group saying, no, we want to be in charge of Yemen. And there's a clash. Clearly, though, they have no solid governance right now. A lot of that region is lawless. To make things even worse, Yemen may very well be the first country in modern history to completely run out of fresh water. Think about that. And if you actually watch some of the things, let's say PBS did a great special. We have Al-Qaeda down here on the coastline of Yemen. This is the last bastion for Al-Qaeda. They train, they equip, they gather. They're headquartered there. Now, one other thing about Yemen, they have a refugee problem. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, yeah, of course they have a refugee problem. There must be people going down to the beach every single day, getting on boats and getting the heck out of there. No, quite the opposite. Yemen actually has 88,000, more than 88,000 refugees. Ah, you're kidding me. Where did they come from? They actually come right over here to Yemen from Somalia and Ethiopia. Now, of course, that puts a huge logistics burden on Yemen, but think about this. How bad does your neighborhood have to be over here in Africa that you actually come home and say, honey, I've had enough of this. We're going to pack up, grab the kids, and we're moving to Yemen because that's going to make life better. Seriously. Wow. That gives you some idea of the unrest over here. Right down here in Somalia, this is the Horn of Africa. I'll point that out to you. This is where all those pirate events are occurring, when Somalians are going out and capturing merchant shipping. If you go see that movie, Captain Phillips, that all takes place out in here. But these people are so desperate, those that aren't actually going to Yemen, they're taking these small boats and they're going out as far as 1,200 nautical miles on open ocean to hijack tankers and freighters. That's some serious human desperation right there. The one other thing I'll mention about Iran, and this was in the New York Times, and so if you go to the New York Times and you're able to find this article, it was only a few weeks ago. There's one individual I want to tell you about, because you probably haven't heard of him. Major General Soleimani. Major General Soleimani is actually the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force. Now, the Quds Force is kind of like a cross between the CIA and special forces for them. They cause mischief everywhere around the world. Their tentacles are everywhere, and they don't do good things. To give you an idea of what they've done recently that I know you've heard of, it was just a little over a year ago that a Saudi Arabian ambassador was nearly assassinated in Washington, D.C. The attempt on his life, the plan to assassinate that ambassador from Saudi Arabia, was the Quds Force. And I share with you Major General Soleimani's name only because he is very much like the Rommel was for the Germans. I'm not a fan, but I do respect him as an adversary. He is smart, he is clever, he is motivated, and believes in the cause. And he's a professional. But it doesn't matter so much what I think of him, is what does the region think of him? Because I'll tell you what, he puts fear in a lot of people's hearts. And he is a huge influence on what is taking place right now with the new Iraqi government. Why should I be concerned with Iraq? Again, they have a lot of Shia, and we've also given them over $11 billion worth of military hardware. Be nice to know how those things are going to get used in the future. Obviously, Iran is also trying to develop nuclear weapons. The other important thing in the region I want to share with you are the 3 strategic choke points. We have the Suez Canal, Bab al-Mandab down here, and we also have the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is so narrow it can be closed by surface-to-surface missiles. This area can also be mined. Those are our concerns with regards to Iran, because if they shut down this strait, again, oil doesn't flow out of here. And that's critical to them. If that oil doesn't flow for 6 months, yeah, as Americans we pay some higher gas prices, but big deal. Their way of life changes. You know, they don't have taxes in Saudi Arabia. They get like tax refund checks. They're called royalty payments, but they're paid every month to the people that live there in Saudi Arabia. That oil shuts down, those checks aren't coming. In 6 months, it gets crazy. Oh, over here in our country, yeah, we're paying more for gas. But you know what? My beer's still cold. I'm watching cable TV, and Domino's delivers. So what's the problem for us? Well, the problem for us is we need that region to stay stable. We need oil to flow to market, and we need to keep our presence in this region and ensure that oil is actually traded in US dollars. Let's talk about Egypt for a second. Obviously, Egypt has gone through a tough time. Mubarak is out. The people had a revolution. They put in a Muslim Brotherhood leader, freely elected, but it wasn't what the people wanted. There's been lots of revolts and turmoil in that country, and now that the military is back in charge. The future for Egypt is uncertain, and there are concerns about the violence that's going on internally, because do we want to continue to support them? If the military is running it right now and the violence is breaking out, do I want to give military aid there to them? That's a question a lot of Americans have been having. Some would say absolutely not. But understand, aid is going to get to them. By who? China. China would love to be in Egypt. All right, Mitch, well, I'm cool with that. Let China have it. Let them take the mission. Let them worry about Egypt. Let's just get the heck out of there and save our money. I hear you. I do. Not a bad argument. But understand, we want to keep this whole region stable. We would like to get Egypt back to the way it was 5 years ago. Tourism, more of an economy going. Clearly, we'd like to have a freer people. But we also are concerned about the Suez Canal. That connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, then out to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, the Pacific. Are we ready to give that up as a nation? Now let's take a moment to talk about North Africa and Africa. Now, I really need to put this in context for people, because I don't think people appreciate the size of that continent. When we talk about their problems, they're big problems on a big piece of earth. Does that kind of put things in perspective for you? Africa is so large, I can put all of Europe, all of the United States, plus Alaska and China on it, and I still have open space. So when we look towards Africa and we see problems and people say, well, just send in the Marines. Let's just send some forces over there. Understand, this is enormous. So I hope that helps put some of it into perspective. Now, I won't try to cover the vastness of it, but I'll speak very broadly. Poor governance is really the mark of this region. Poor governance, drug wars, human trafficking, and a lot of unrest. You're familiar with North Africa right now because you recall back that Tunisia is where the Arab Spring started, where a young man actually set himself on fire. He was a fruit peddler, but he had finally had enough of the corruption and the repression, and he actually, out of frustration, lit himself on fire. That caused a huge revolt in Tunisia, and then that spread down to Libya and Egypt. Tunisia has had free elections, but it's still not a functional government, and there's still unrest in there. Libya is still struggling, specifically to get its oil industry back on, because it needs the revenue. But Libya, as far as I know, have not yet had free elections, and they're still struggling to get their governance in order. Egypt, we talked about a little bit, but again, a lot of unrest. The point that I'm trying to make is this whole area is not yet settled. You compound that with the problems right now up with Syria, where we're all pretty familiar with what's going on, and we've got some challenges. Now, there is a lot of Islamic unrest going on up here in northern Africa. How bad is it? Well, I'll tell you that the French, now, the French don't normally send troops anywhere. They send the French Foreign Legion, and they're a great unit. But they've actually sent French regular forces down into Mali. Mali is an old territory that they used to have. They have a tie to it because it used to be a colony area for them. And so they feel a kindred need to go back down and try and help them quell the Islamic unrest and to keep it stable. But I don't know if that's the only reason they're down there. What happens when there's unrest on this much territory or over in the Middle East? People, just like those fleeing to Yemen, they leave the area. Where do all these people go when there's a lot of violence? They flow right up here, right past the Strait of Gibraltar, and they flow up into Europe. We'll talk about Europe shortly. But part of the reason that they're down there is to try and keep this whole region stable so that people want to stay here, that they feel secure staying here, that they can have a way of life and better life. So it's critical that we get that area under control. Now, Africa as a continent has an awful lot of resources. It's huge with natural gas, oil, gold, uranium. But because it has poor governance, it's very easy for countries to come in and negotiate either with tribal leaders or drug lords, people that are kind of running that area, and get permissions to go in there and get those resources. But the problem with that is when you're dealing with those kind of governments that aren't matured, the money that flows in just stays with that top-tier leadership. It doesn't flow out to the people. They don't get the infrastructure. They don't get the benefits of it. They just end up, as a country, losing the resources. But because they have resources and the world's all about money, countries want to be in Africa. For 150 years, the US and Europe had been the #1 trading partners with the continent. But over the last few years, China has actually surpassed us. It wasn't long ago, in 1991, China only had $1 billion worth of bilateral trade with Africa. Today, they're up to $150 billion of bilateral trade. They've surpassed us. So we see that China now has an influence greater than our own in Africa. Now, we're still #2, and we can continue to work on those partnerships. But I show you how vast it is because the only option you have in Africa is diplomacy, partnerships, engagement. There is no way for anyone ever to go in here and take over areas because of the size. And when I say take over, I really mean respond to unrest. This is going to have to solve itself internally. The last thing I want to say about Africa, I just want to touch on Libya for 1 second, because I do think that the present administration got mislabeled. Remember we were going after Gaddafi, and NATO was running the air campaign over there to oust him? And then they stopped, and we came in, and we said we led from the rear? That's not true. And I feel bad because any president that was in charge would have picked up the air mission. What had happened in Libya? NATO just ran out of resources. They weren't able to continue the mission. And so we stepped up as a nation and continued that air campaign in order to lead the rebels to finally apprehend Gaddafi. But on that point, though, I think it's an important thing to realize as we start to move into Europe, the situation that NATO is in. These are the main countries of Europe. Today we look at it as the European Union, but we also look at it as NATO. Now keep in mind, these countries have been working together now for many, many years. They have old alliances. But I'm kind of concerned where things are going in Europe. Some of my concerns are, well, #1, they're second in the world for GDP. That's a good thing. The United States is still #1 for GDP. But they're number one for debt. A lot of Americans think it's us. Well, it's not America. We're number two. Yes, we have $17+ trillion worth of debt, but Europe has more. They have $17+ trillion also, but they're just a few $100 billion ahead of us. Well, what does their weakened financial position mean for us? Well, as I just alluded to, when they were down there in Libya, they ran out of resources. How strong can NATO and Europe be with that kind of debt? We're all aware of the sovereign debt issues that are in the region and some of the angst that's creating. I find that troubling. These countries have been partners for many, many, many years. But these alliances, these friendships, there's a lot of growing angst because some countries just don't have a viable economy. And those that do are bailing them out. Can that go on indefinitely? How strong is NATO going to be if Greece gets to a point where they can't afford to put oil in their Navy ships anymore and actually go to sea? What will that mean for Russia, where we have a president, Putin, over there, who wakes up every day wanting to make Russia great again and has expansionist ideas? That concerns me. The other thing I'll point out with the European Union, if you look at this, 1.8% of their GDP is agriculture, 24.6% is industry, and 73% is services. That's not unlike the US. Our numbers are a little different, but we also have 79% of services. We've become service economies. People aren't making things anymore. We need to start our manufacturing again, because manufacturing, extracting resources, refining them, and then sending them out into market and selling them overseas brings new wealth to a country. If you're just doing services, you're just cycling that money around within your own borders. And I think that it's kind of a coincidence that they have such a high service industry and such a small agriculture and manufacturing industry, and they're number one in debt. Because our model is very similar to theirs. And that model is quite different than China's. The next thing I'll take a little bit of time to talk to you about is just the Western Pacific. It's a vast region. There's 38 nations out there in this region when we refer to the Western Pacific. Let's talk about China right now. China has had a very strong economy these last few years. Most people don't realize, while we're running a deficit of $17 trillion, they have $3.3 trillion in reserve. That's money in the bank that they can spend any day they want. 45% of their economy is actually manufacturing. It's industry. 10% of agriculture. The thing about China, too, is, remember I mentioned that we're the monetary reserve to the world? Well, China isn't that. But China realizes that it's not to their benefit always to buy US dollars. What they've actually been doing is creating currency swaps with 18 nations. What that means is they take a bushel of their money, they give it to another country, who then gives them a bushel of their currency, and now they can be trading partners. The last currency swap they did was with Australia, either this past March or this past April. So they've got 18 countries that they do currency swaps with. They're certainly with all the BRIC nations. If you've heard BRIC, it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They're forming partnerships. When we talk about India, India has the second largest labor force in the world, and China is number one. China has a vast need for resources, and that's why they're so interested in getting a presence in Africa, in South America, in Egypt, in the Middle East. And I think that that could have IMF implications for us as a nation if we're not cautious. I do think that the US dollar someday, not in the near term, could be threatened with this reserve status. Now, I have some people say, Mitch, there is no way that China would ever let our economy collapse. There's no way they would want to see the US dollar delinked from the currency reserve, because our currency would go worthless so quickly. I'm like, well, why would you say that? Well, they say, well, we owe China $1.3 trillion. So certainly they want to get paid back, and so if our currency went worthless, they wouldn't get paid back. I'm like, okay, that's a good argument. What's your other argument? Well, the other argument is that we're their biggest consumer. They don't want to lose us. We stock Walmart with the stuff that they make. All right, well, that seems reasonable too. But let me give you the counter argument on why I think it would be in China's interest to see us collapse. Not saying it's gonna, but think about this. Would China be willing to write off $1.3 trillion worth of debt to the U.S. to become the world currency reserve? I don't know. I know this. I have just spent $1 trillion to revamp healthcare in my country. We took one system, undid it, developed a new one, and spent $1 trillion on it. We thought it was that important to us. To actually have economic power for the next 30, 50 years, would China be willing to write off $1.3 trillion? That they may expect, like many Americans, if we don't get our fiscal responsibility together, they're not going to get paid back any more than I'm going to get my Social Security check, or many Americans. That's one thing to think about. But what about that relationship where we buy so much of their stuff? Don't they want to keep that going? I'm sure they do. But think about this. If our currency collapsed and the relative strength of their currency went way up, wouldn't we just be one big yard sale as a country? Couldn't China just come over to the U.S. and buy anything they want? Absolutely pennies on the dollar? It could happen. That's why we need to be financially strong as a nation. There's a lot of discussion with the Korean Peninsula. There's unrest there. I'll tell you, North Korea, they're always poor, they're always hungry, but they've been especially hungry these last few years. There's starvation and misery there that they haven't seen in decades. What does that mean to us? Well, when people get so desperate that it's actually their existence on the line, they'll do things that they wouldn't normally do under normal circumstances. Hey, look, if I'm drowning and we're best friends, but I'm drowning and you come out to rescue me, I don't care if you have all the love in your heart, you want to help me out. I am going to do things to you to survive that I wouldn't normally do under any other circumstances. Countries are the same way. North Korea produces weapons of mass destruction. They know they shouldn't sell it, but it brings money in. They can trade those for food. So their appetite during this year and the years coming up in the future, I believe their appetite to take risk and trade in weapons of mass destruction is going to rise. Are there any regions in the world willing to buy his weapons of mass destruction? Sure. Could they do it? I don't know. Seems like there's an awful lot of unrest in Egypt these days. Do you really feel that in Egypt, those custom agents are really on the top of their game right now? Could they smuggle stuff into those regions through, I don't know, Yemen? When you've got desperate people in those other countries, a bag of money goes a long way. Things to think about. Do I see a war in the peninsula? Probably not. Does China ever want to see North Korea and South Korea get in a war? Certainly not. A couple reasons. Number one, China doesn't want to have 28 million starving Koreans fleeing north and come into their country. The other reason they don't want to see it, and understand this, South Korea's economy is doing fantastic right now. They are absolutely growing greatly relative to the rest of the world. China actually sees South Korea as an economic competitor. When you're as big as China and you've got as many people you need to feed, market share matters, even 2%, 3%. Imagine, from China's perspective, if North and South Korea ever united and the North Koreans started producing to the same degree that the South Koreans are. That's kind of a concern to China. Now, let's talk about South Korea. Would South Korea want to go to war with North Korea? Absolutely not. We know that. We've had one of their ships sunk back in 2009, 2010, I believe. 104 men on board that ship was sunk by a torpedo from North Korea. And they periodically shell certain regions over there, usually these little islands, the EEZ, Economic Exclusion Zone. Because South Korea just wants to keep making and growing their economy. And if they ever did have a war, same thing. Who's going to take charge of 28 million starving people? That would set them back. So I think what you're going to see is North Korea is going to just remain isolated. And if it implodes, it implodes. But I don't think there's going to be a war triggered over there anytime soon. But the humanitarian response we would have to give for North Korea, if that ever happened, that would be significant. I think that if you look at Japan right now, Japan has been languishing in a bad economy for years. Much like us, they've had interest rates at zero for a really long time. And of course, they took that hit just a little over a year and a half ago up in northern Japan with the Fukushima nuclear plant after the earthquake and tsunami, which is a shame. So there's a portion of their area that might actually have to be evacuated if they can't contain it better. And that'll certainly affect their economy in the years to come. So I think the last thing I'm really going to touch on about Japan is that they're a strong industrial nation, their economy's poor, and they're absolutely dependent on resources in Japan. As are a lot of these countries. Even China is dependent on resources. And even good allies like Australia, one of our best partners ever, and there's nothing threatening that. But they do a lot of trade with China. And as I mentioned, they've recently signed a currency swap. With these bad economic times and the actual need for resources by many nations, what becomes critical are called maritime economic exclusion zones. And all that is, that's the 12 miles of water off a nation's shore. Everything within that 12 miles belongs to that country. Unfortunately, some of these countries are so close that those EEZs overlap. And also, these are some small nations in relative size to China who likes to remind everybody it's called the South China Sea for a reason. And so when it comes to fishing or mineral rights or looking for petroleum reserves, all of that comes into play. And so there can be tense times over there. China is trying to take more of a security cooperation role over here away from the U.S. Not that they're going to do it, but a lot of these countries are our partners. That's why we're building bases down in Australia and in Guam to keep our presence forward. But China is also expanding its navy, and they're going to start going out there as well, and that concerns some of our friends. And that's really all I want to say about the Western Pacific. So we have just an overview sense of what's going on out there. One of my biggest concerns is I'm not convinced that our most violent days in this war are behind us. And by war or overseas contingencies, we've been fighting radicals and terrorists now since 2001. This is a map done by the Aon Corporation out of Britain. And this is for this year. The red shows you the really severe areas that we are concerned about terrorists. And of course, you can see the United States, the threat's very low. But this map is disturbing. We look at what it's like in Africa. We look what it's like in the Middle East. Was it that bad 10 years ago when we started all of this? Or has it gotten worse? Are our most violent days behind us? Or are they still coming? Are our worst financial troubles behind us? I don't know. I suspect they're not. The purpose of me going around and talking about the world a bit so we understand where we are in relation to it is just to have some context to what's going on. Our economy's bad, but lots of countries are having bad economies. Economically, there's a lot of debt, inflation, currency concerns going on. We talked about Europe and some of the angst growing over there between the sovereign debt of those nations. Terrorism remains a growing threat in many regions. And I would say especially North Africa. We talked about the concerns of, say, Pakistan. If their economy completely collapses, what happens if North Korea completely implodes? The U.S. dominance, is it eroding? Well, it is a little bit in Africa. We're second place. Doesn't mean that we're losing and we can get it back. But we have to reestablish ourselves. The IMF monetary reserve, are we strong enough to remain the world's currency? I hope so. But remember, it's always about the money. Other nations look after their best interests. And if it suits their best interests to take over that role, they'll do it. Weapons of mass destruction, certainly those are growing. North Korea, in just the last few years, now has nuclear capability. Iran is pursuing it. We're seeing the concerns of weapons of mass destruction in Syria. An increased need for resources. Water, agriculture, there's a lot of starving people out there. I mentioned that Yemen is going to become the first nation in modern history, potentially, to completely run out of fresh water. So all of that is simply to convince you to realize that the world really needs the United States to be a strong nation. We have to be the leader of the world, but we also have to be moral, and we also have to be financially stable. We can certainly be the strongest nation in the world because we have that, but we don't want to be a bully, and we want to be able to maintain that military superiority. If we don't change our own national policies, the way that we spend money, the debt that we're bringing up, the fact that we have a sluggish economy that hasn't yet got the inertia to break out of this recession, will we still be an economic power 5 or 10 years from now? That's why I'm doing this. I've got some ideas I think can help.